I want to invite to the stage our morning keynote speaker, Nick Hanauer. Nick is one of the most important thinkers, speakers, thought leaders, advocates, actors in the political economy space in the United States in our time. There are a lot of people who talk, and Nick can talk, but there are a few people that put that into action as effectively as Nick Hanauer. So I'm very honored he's coming to the stage. He's been agreed to be with us today. Let's give him a round of applause. Nick, come on up. There you go. Take her away.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Good morning. Well, it's fun to be here, fun to talk to policymakers about economics. I am going to try to jam through a bunch of reasonably complex and controversial material in just a few minutes, and then DJ and I will have a chat and a Q&A session that I hope will include most of you, because I think that will be the most interesting part. As I said, I'm here to talk about economic policy, but to be clear, if our democracy collapses, making economic policy will become the least of our worries. And I think it's clear to me, I hope it's clear to you, that we're living through an extremely unstable time. If you're not genuinely worried about our country, I think you're not paying attention. My first point this morning is that our nation's challenge is not political, it is economic. The foundational problem is objective, growing inequality. People on both the left and the right are super angry, and that anger is threatening the social cohesion that makes a thriving democracy and an economy possible. Our country will not be better until people feel better, and they will not feel better until they do better. And here's the rub: they will not do better until they are paid more. Everything else is commentary or a lie, in my opinion. My second point is that for as long as policymakers on the left and the right are in the thrall of our existing economic orthodoxy, what I call neoclassical economics, neoliberal narratives, and the trickle-down policy agenda, we cannot fix that problem. In order to fix our economy and our politics, we're going to have to break free of these bankrupt ideologies. And in this talk, I'll suggest a little bit about how. I also want to say, because it's so much in the news, that there is a huge amount of discussion about race and the role it's playing in our democracy and in our politics today. And to be clear, racism is a huge, huge problem. But we have had good economies that were racist economies, and we have had bad economies that are racist economies. I do not, as a policymaker, know how to suck the racism out of racists, but I do know how to make them prosperous. And I believe in my heart that if we make everybody prosperous, racism will play a smaller role in the way in which we treat ourselves, treat one another. So what went wrong is 40 years of neoclassical economics, neoliberalism, trickle-down economics that has resulted in some of the worst economic inequality in our nation's history. 3 folks own the rest is the bottom half combined. The way to characterize the fundamental problem is that today, approximately $2 trillion per year that used to flow into the wages of ordinary Americans now is captured by the top 1% of earners. The first problem is that the way in which we share wages, the wage shares have changed dramatically in 1980. About the top 1% of Americans captured about 8.5% of national income, while the bottom 50% of Americans captured almost 18%. Fast forward 30, 40 years, the top 1% now capture over 20%. I think in 2017 it's about 22%. If you do your divided bys, that's about $1.25 trillion more that the top 1% of earners earns than they would have if the wage shares had stayed the same. Second problem is the way in which labor as a percentage of GDP has fallen. While profits to corporations have risen by almost the same amount. Wages used to be about 52% of GDP, now they're about 46% of GDP. Profits used to be about 5 or 6% of GDP, now they're approximately 11. 6% of GDP at 18 trillion is approximately another $1 trillion. So in round numbers, $2.25 trillion that used to go to ordinary people now goes to the very rich. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see there are all sorts of ways of understanding wealth shares. Rich people used to have about 25% of our wealth. Now it's over 40. And of course, to add insult to injury, the costs to live in our country tracked more with the wages of wealthy people than they did with the wages of the people in the bottom 90% whose wages have stagnated. And so not only aren't you making any more money, but the cost of education, the cost of housing, and the cost of healthcare have gone astronomically higher. And as a consequence, people are super angry. They're super, super angry. And they have a reason to be angry, because it's not like we're all suffering. Many people are falling behind, but a few of us are getting farther and farther ahead, and people on the left and the right are angry. And so you get this. So why did this happen? A lot of people think this had to happen, and I totally disagree. This did not have to happen. We did this. And we did this because across the political spectrum, people from the left and right accepted a set of ideas. They accepted orthodox neoclassical economics. They accepted a neoliberal narrative that was derived from that. And they accepted what I call the trickle-down policy framework that in turn was based on the neoliberal narrative. So these claims are not true, but they are plausible. And I want to take you through, and this is where it gets technical, and try to get you to see that these ideas we do not have to continue to accept. So the neoclassical economic model was built in the middle of the last century, and the goal was mathematical elegance. They were not so much interested in the real world, and in fact, almost none of it was based on any sort of empirical observations. The foundation of neoclassical economics is their assumption about human behavior. They assume people are something called homo economicus, which is that every single person is rational, calculating, and selfish. And that assumption makes possible something called representative agents, which means you can put one perfectly rational, perfectly calculating, and perfectly selfish person into a model and use that to figure out what will happen in the real world. None of that is true. And I'll get back to that when I talk about the alternative. The system that neoclassical economics assumes that we operate in is that the economy is an equilibrium system, which means it is stable and is the kind of system that will come to rest and is stable. It assumes that the system is something called Pareto optimal, which means essentially that it is always in the best state, and any change in it will destroy any change in one area will destroy welfare in another. And finally, neoclassical economics assumes that an adequate measure of welfare is GDP, that output is how we should measure how well we're doing. From that set of economic ideas, we derived the neoliberal narrative. Again, I'm trying to go really fast through some really complicated stuff, but basically, the idea of neoliberalism is that the narrow pursuit of self-interest automatically creates just and positive social outcomes. That capitalism works by effectively allocating existing resources, that freedom means to be free of constraint, that markets are perfectly efficient and should be left alone, that the only responsibility of business is to its shareholders, that there is always a trade-off between justice and growth, that morality and economics do not overlap, and that the rich deserve to be rich and the poor deserve to be poor. And from that narrative, we have derived the trickle-down economics policy framework, which is tax cuts for the rich, deregulation for the powerful, and wage suppression for everybody else. So these policies are not true. This is some of my favorite trickle-down. But so the cornerstone of trickle-down economics is the claim that raising wages kills jobs. You've heard it so many times, it's become a truism. But there is no economic evidence for this. There's no empirical evidence for this. The minimum wage has been raised 22 times in our nation's history. Unless the economy was in recession, employment always goes up after a minimum wage increase. Why? Because that's how capitalism works. Because the fundamental dynamic in a market economy is the feedback loop between customers and businesses. And since wages are where everybody's money comes from, in a world where people have no money, no one will buy any stuff. So high wage places are always outperform low wage places. This slide, no place in America has run a more honest experiment about what happens when you raise the minimum wage in Seattle, Washington. This slide shows restaurant employment, food service employment in Washington state over these years. You can see the abrupt change that happened in 2014 from the slide when we raised the minimum wage to $15. I want to underscore one point, which is that in Seattle, Washington today, tipped workers earn $15 an hour plus tips. The federal minimum wage is $2.13 plus tips. It's a 700% difference. If there was ever a clear experiment in whether raising wages killed jobs, this is it. And in fact, our restaurant industry outperforms virtually every other major city in America. I believe that only San Francisco has a higher density of restaurants than Seattle, Washington does today, even of fast food restaurants. And that's, of course, because when restaurants pay restaurant workers enough so that even they can afford to eat in restaurants, it turns out to be pretty good for the restaurant business. Again, if higher wages killed jobs, it could not also be possible that King County, Washington has the fastest economic growth of any region in the country and has had for 3 or 4 years. The idea that tax cuts for rich people create growth is, again, another one of the deepest ideas embedded in our sort of neoliberal and trickle-down assumptions about how the world works. And of course, this is playing out in Washington, D.C. right now. But it is quite easy to determine if tax cuts for rich people create growth, because you can actually go back all the way to 1940s and see. And what you find, of course, is that there is no correlation between employment growth and top tax rate, no correlation between investment growth and top tax rate, no correlation between productivity growth, GDP growth, real median income growth, per capita revenue growth, and top tax rate. None, zero. In fact, if there was a correlation, that line would be sloped down to the right. Indeed, it points slightly upwards. That's not proof that raising taxes on rich people creates growth, but it is certainly proof that lowering them doesn't. And the final claim that regulation kills prosperity is it's just absurd. Take it from someone. It takes one to know one. Corporations hate regulation for the same reason that robbers hate cops, because it makes it harder to steal. If it was true that highly regulated places were less prosperous, then Stockholm would look like that, and that would look like Stockholm. There are 0 examples on planet Earth of prosperous, stable, and secure economies that are unregulated. 100% of the places that you would likely flee if we had to leave the United States would be highly regulated, high-tax hellholes like Sweden. Every one of the assumptions of neoclassical economics turns out to be untrue. The people who created these assumptions were not bad people. They simply used the tools at the time. And there were a bunch of observations about human behavior and system dynamics that they were not equipped to make. But we now know with scientific certainty that all of those fundamental assumptions were wrong. And over the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a revolution in our understanding of both human behavior and system dynamics that I think is going to lead to an entirely different way to understand economics. At the core of it is a completely different view of human behavior. So people are, turns out, not Homo economicus, they're Homo sapiens. We are cooperative, reciprocal, emotional, and heuristic. And that makes it almost impossible to use a representative agent in a model. The systems turn out, a human economy turns out to be not non-equilibrium. Not equilibrium, it's a non-equilibrium system. It's more like an ecosystem found in nature. It's complex, adaptive, and positive sum. It's unstable, it doesn't self-correct. Understanding the economy is best, if you want to understand it in a metaphorical way, using the metaphor of an ecosystem will lead you in the right direction, not using the metaphor of a machine, which is what we presently do. And finally, it is becoming even clearer by the day that GDP is a woefully inadequate measure of prosperity and welfare for a variety of reasons. The first is that GDP does not tell you anything about how we distribute prosperity. It is possible, and indeed we have, a society where GDP goes up every year, but that's on average because a few of us are doing super well while most people aren't. The second problem with GDP is that it gives you it gives you false positives all the time. So if we were all to go out, for instance, take a little break and then vandalize all the cars in the parking lot and come back, GDP would go up, right? Because we had set off a chain reaction that would involve a lot of business activity. Clearly, we have not increased welfare. And so there are a bunch of people doing work on how to best think about what prosperity really is, and our natural language definition is the accumulation of solutions to human problems. The difference between a poor society and a rich one is how many problems that society solves for its citizens, and the rate at which you accumulate them is best understood as growth. There are actually technical ways to characterize this. One of them is called fitness, which is basically, again, taking a very complicated thing and making it simple, variety plus complexity. That the economies that produce the highest variety of products and the most complex products are the richest. And from that better understanding of economics, we can derive a new narrative that we're calling solutionism, which is that capitalism works by evolving solutions to human problems, that the purpose of the firm is to solve human problems, and it has broad responsibility. Morality and economics are actually the same thing because prosperity in human societies really rests on your ability to solve other people's problems. That growth is really best understood as a feedback loop between increasing amounts of innovation and demand, and crucially, inclusion. Including more people in more robust ways in the economy is what drives that feedback loop between innovation and demand. So I just want to make clear that we, in our society, have sort of programmed our way of thinking to believe that inclusion is something we should do if and when we have growth. We should do it for moral reasons. And the thing I'm trying to emphasize is that that's backwards, that inclusion is the thing that actually creates growth in market economies. And we can look around the world for empirical evidence of this, and what you will find is that prosperity and stability is perfectly correlated with inclusion. You show me an inclusive society, I will show you a prosperous one. You show me an exclusionary society, and I will show you a poverty-stricken hellhole. There are no counterexamples. So, again, there's an enormous amount of cutting-edge science and research behind all of this. I'm actually writing a book on it. Hopefully you'll read it, but it's very difficult to get through it in very quick time. But the point is that All of this massively changes how we should think about policy. If we tell the trickle-down story, that the rich are job creators, and the more money they have, the more jobs they create, and therefore the lower their taxes should be, we are going to get an even more unequal society and even less social cohesion. If we tell a different story, that thriving middle class creates growth, that it's people that are the source of growth in our economy, we're going to get an economy that benefits everyone. There is a reason that Washington State is doing well. And I think it's because we are reasonable practitioners of this second way. We are a reasonably inclusive society. We have done, I think, cool and important things around driving both innovation and demand, but there is much, much more that we need to do. I want to be clear that, in my opinion, raising wages doesn't kill jobs, it creates them. Raising the minimum wage to $15 isn't bad for capitalism and growth, it's good for it, despite what the powerful will tell you. It will not hurt the people intended to help any more than eliminating slavery was going to hurt the people it intended to help, or giving women the right to vote was going to hurt the people it intended to help. These are the refrains that the powerful always tell the weak in the face of change. Smart regulation and higher standards do not kill prosperity, despite what the Koch brothers may tell you, and high taxes on rich people are how we pay for investments in the things that make middle class thrive, despite what our friends at Goldman Sachs may tell you. How fast the median wage is rising is a better measure of prosperity than how many billionaires we create. The golden rule of economics is that inclusion creates growth. The idea that we should include people in the economy if and when we have growth is wrong and backwards. If we focus economic policy on political and economic inclusion, as policymakers, we will be both on the right side of history and economic growth. Our democracy is not being driven apart by Facebook or fake news. Those factors simply exploit a deeper objective reality, that most people's lives have gotten worse while a few of us have done extremely well, and that injustice and the anger it engenders is fertile ground for political instability. The only way to fix that is to make most people's lives objectively better. And that will, of course, inevitably lead to trade-offs wealthy and powerful people will object to. But if you want to bend the arc of history towards justice, you are just going to antagonize some people, mostly rich people. You have to get used to it. Making our country better will require the courage to be bold and to contradict orthodox thinking and entrenched interests. I hope we are up to that task. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I want to, I have a graduate degree in the dismal science, so I can appreciate the complexity of talking about economics. Before we get into the weeds, I want to ask you just personally, I think you really jumped into this sort of political game, or the political economy game, I think, in a public way, only maybe 4 or 5, 6 years ago. I seem to recall, as an outsider, your first sort of foray was kind of behind the scenes supporting some of the $15 minimum wage work in Federal Way. There may have been others that I'm not aware of. But that then, of course, goes to Seattle. I think one of the bets you all made was that if you can influence the cities, you're going to get to where all the people live anyway, and you don't have to go to states. And then all of a sudden, you've got Democratic nominees for president arguing whether it should be 12 or 15 or 1150 or whatever. Are you surprised at how much success you've had in framing or influencing the political debate in just a few years?
Well, yes. The short answer is yes. If truth be told, so I made the first presentation on the $15 minimum wage in the fall of 2012. And it was to a group sort of like this, except for they're all 100% huge progressive donors and Democrats. And people openly laughed. Like they didn't even hide their derision. They were our friends, right? But we were quite sure that we had to prosecute a different way of talking about economics and just, soldiered on. But to be absolutely clear, when we chose the number 15, we chose the number 15 right after President Obama had called on Congress to raise the minimum wage from $7.25 to $9. And we were like, okay, that's not going to work out. We have to create more political space. And while I thought then and remain convinced that there's a very easy, precise, and true economic case you can make for $15 an hour, and in fact, I think you can make a case for a much higher minimum wage. We definitely were doing it to try to create political space, so we weren't negotiating between $7.25 and $9. We're negotiating between $7.25 and $15. But it took, honestly, the crazy, bold thinking of my collaborator and partner, David Rolfe, to throw down in CTAC and say, to hell with it, let's go for it. To
CTAC,
really,
not Federal Way.
Yeah. Federal, yeah.
Well, no, I think you're right. It's CTAC, right? I said
CTAC.
Federal Way, but it's
CTAC.
not.
It was CTAC. The town of CTAC.
Yeah. So
but just to be clear, my interest in political economy went back probably 10 years, and I had this. People have often asked me, how did you get into this mess? And what happened was in 2007, I think, I got a hold of the IRS income share tax tables. And I mentioned it. And what you saw was the way in which income was concentrating at the top in this crazy way, that it had gone from 8, by the way, in 2007, it had a high point, 23.7% or something like that. So the share of income going to the top 1% had gone from 8% to like 23%, while the share of income going to the bottom 50% of Americans had gone from 70.5 to like 11 or 12. And you're like, and I just put all that data into a spreadsheet and just, you just extrapolate out another 30 years, and you're like, holy crap, we're dead.
Yeah.
If this keeps going at the same pace, but in another 30 years, the top 1% of Americans is going to have like 45% of national income, and the bottom 50% of Americans are going to have 6%. We're going to have a revolution. That is not sustainable.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I was doing all this research on actual economics. It's a long story of how I got involved in that. And so when you put this stuff together, it just became clear that there was, but both the way in which we had thought about how the economy works was just wrong, and the direction we were going in was just scary and bad. And this is before the shit hit the fan, right? This is in 2007. But it was really clear to me 10 years ago that down this path led despair.
Yeah.
And so and here we are, right? Here we are in an economy where people are so angry that it is tearing apart the fabric of our society.
Do you? I mean, when you delivered this message at TED and some other locations, I think you were very savvy, in my view, about couching that as I'm a capitalist. I'm here to save capitalism, not a progressive, though progressive you may have been or still are. But there was a sort of a calmness about that, even in the Pitchforks article at Politico. There was still sort of like you had your shades on. There's still kind of a calmness. There's a little more houses on fire affect from you now. Do you feel like, look, I got to scream from the rooftops because it is not getting better, it's getting worse?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's getting worse. And I'm a very optimistic person, but I think things are going to get way worse before they get better. I think if you thought the political cycle we just went through was bad, you have seen nothing yet. I think in 4 years, in 3 years and 3 months, it's going to be way worse than what we just went through. Our country has had a good run, but it may end. And, our institutions are under attack. The social cohesion that we depended on has been frayed. And the problem is that a different political leader cannot fix that, right? Like, you can put red lipstick on a pig or you can put blue lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig, right? Wages have been stagnant for 40 years. If you don't change that trajectory, our politics isn't going to improve, and that's hard. And so I'm super worried about the future. And, you know, it's going to take getting very aggressive to make the change necessary to head off what could be some very bad outcomes.
I think you're clearly taking on, as you call it, some truisms in economics that I think many people would hold as self-evidently true.
Yeah.
Like, you raise the cost of labor and the quantity demanded is going to go down. So let me ask you two questions and I want to try to see if I can simplify some of your basic economic argument. Tell me if it's yes or no or not quite, and then you can riff on it. Generally speaking, you're saying two things. One, that the focus on supply-side economics is wrong, that we should focus on the demand side of economics.
No, not quite.
Okay, good. Two, that you didn't say this, but let me say it and tell me if this might fit within your paradigm, that while we are taught, while we learn, while we experience the notion that as cost of labor goes up, the quantity demanded of labor goes down, that in economics happens only when all other variables are held equal. And part of what you're arguing is that never are all other variables held equal. There's a constant feedback loop.
Yeah, okay. So in turn, no and no.
Uh-huh. Okay. I really tried to sort of encapsulate it.
So I'm saying something deeper and way more complex than the way in which you just characterized it.
Okay.
And it's on me and my group of global collaborators to explain this better. But even thinking about the economy as supply and demand is a mischaracterization of what is actually going on. So prosperity in human societies, again, is best understood as the accumulation of solutions to human problems. And the rate at which we collectively solve problems and distribute those solutions to other people is how we create prosperity and economic growth. That process is enabled by a social technology that we call capitalism, which is simply a set of institutions that enable us to cooperate in groups to evolve solutions to human problems via market competition. And that process is driven by increasing amounts of innovation and increasing amounts of demand, right? Probably equally. Innovation is how you solve problems. Demand is how you sustain and incentivize that innovation. And so it is all the things that drive both of those processes that drive economic growth. So we need massive investments in the things that drive innovation, and there's a big list of those things. And we need to make sure that people earn enough to sustain demand and drive that innovation. And, I mean, if you want to shorthand how you would do that, basically including people more robustly in the economy is how you do that, right? You include them as citizens, you include them as workers, you include them as innovators, business people, entrepreneurs. You educate them, you enfranchise them, you pay them well, you make sure they have health care so they're not in crisis all the time. All of those things are what drive the feedback loop between innovation and demand. So it is way more complex and nuanced than just less supply side and more demand side. Mm-hmm. It's the panoply of things that you would do to make people thrive. Mm-hmm. And that's where growth comes from in a market economy. And like, if you just zoom out a little bit and look around the world at where the median family is doing super well, those are the things that mm-hmm. they are surrounded by policies that do that.
As you think about this, a lot of the capitalist economists or economists that study capitalism have commented on it, argue and suggest that there is a gradual and increasing concentration of wealth at the top. I think we see that. The corporations become stronger, more powerful, more protectionist as renters in the system. In your thinking, do you separate out the role of small business versus large corporation? Do you see maybe small business as an extension of the household or the individual, and large corporations are really the primary issue because that's where wealth is concentrated, or do you not make the distinction?
No, I think you raise an interesting point. But I want to address that, but I want to come to your second question, which was this whole idea about raising the price of labor and decreasing demand. That way of understanding that problem is just wrong. Mm-hmm. Claiming that raising wages kills jobs is like claiming that more plants means less animals. Like, it's absurd. Mm-hmm. Like, wages are what drive the demand that sustains business activity and leads to hiring.
At the macroeconomic level.
At every level.
At the microeconomic level, in a small business would say, look, I'd love to pay everybody $60,000 or $70,000 like gravity payments, but I can't afford it. And so I might raise my folks' wages.
But you're confusing microeconomic annoyance with the actual effect. I mean, we pay tipped workers $15 an hour plus tips, right? Mm-hmm. Like, a McDonald's worker in our city earns $15 an hour. In Alabama, they earn $7.25. There are more McDonald's per capita in our city than there are in Alabama. So clearly, they can't afford it. They prefer not to afford it. Look, I have a 16-year-old boy, 17-year-old boy. People always say, like, all these businesses say they can't afford it. And I get it, because if you make the calculation in your head, how much cost and risk is associated with paying workers more, it seems high, but you can't calculate the benefits of operating in a high-wage, high-demand economy. But, in the same way, like 95% of 16-year-old boys say that homework is a waste of their time and an obliteration of their liberties, but we know better, right? Like, I get that. You make them do their homework. Likewise, like, business people always squawk when you raise standards, but when you do, it always gets better for everybody. Now, to be clear, there are business models which are predicated on exploiting people, cheating. Those people will go out of business. It may be true that McDonald's cannot make hamburgers and pay people enough to lead a dignified life, but here's what I can guarantee you, DJ, you will not run out of hamburgers. That's a great thing about capitalism, is that someone will figure out how to make hamburgers and pay people a dignified wage. And so anyway, but I want to get to concentration, because for sure, if you believe that prosperity comes from increasing amounts of innovation and demand, then you want to find where innovation comes from, and it does not come from giant enterprises. It comes from small businesses. And if you want to include people in the economy, then having way, way, way more smaller businesses and fewer giant enterprises is where you want to go. And so there is absolutely no doubt that one of the most corrosive and problematic elements of our present economy is the way in which we walked away from antitrust enforcement and have allowed economic power to concentrate in few hands. And we have created these giant enterprises and these giant industries that exploit people and are essentially immune from...
So let me ask about the antitrust issue, and let me put it in the context of your background. Early investor in Amazon, first non-family investor. That would be one home run, but then you launched a business on your own, sold it for $4, $5, $6 billion to Microsoft. That's sort of a second home run. That one would get you in the Hall of Fame. You hit twice. That's pretty impressive. Do you think that we are getting to a point where we need to not just have a renewed discussion about antitrust, but apply it to modern day monopolies like Google, Amazon, Facebook?
For sure.
Should those organizations come under antitrust scrutiny?
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, there aren't that many rules that you can extract from human history, but for sure one of them is concentrated power is never good.
Yeah.
Right? It just is never good. You want power dispersed, whether it's political power, economic power, whatever it is. It never is good for the common good for a few people to have everything and everybody else to have nothing. And so I think that we should apply antitrust in a much more aggressive way from the top. But DJ, there's a whole suite of things we should be doing from the bottom up. Mm-hmm. So for instance, if I was king, I would apply labor standards progressively. That is to say, I would instantly raise the minimum wage for all of the nation's largest enterprises to like $22 an hour. Because while it may be the case that some small business in some small town will be challenged by a $22 minimum wage, I can absolutely guarantee you that the local Walmart will not. Right?
Yeah.
And I want to tilt the playing field of our economy towards small businesses. I want to create an economy where it is easier to build and sustain a small business, not harder. Where being small, where you have an advantage being small, not a disadvantage. So, small businesses in this country have come to the conclusion that the enemy of small business is government and labor. That's not true. The enemy of small business is big business, and the ways in which being big gives you a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger advantage. And if we want to have a robust economy with shared prosperity, then we have to find a way to make sure that our economic landscape is dominated by small businesses, not just a few giant companies.
You said if you were king. We don't have a king in the United States, at least this week.
No. Wait for it.
Ever thought about running for president?
No. Yeah. My wife objects strenuously. Yeah.
It's good that you listen to your wife.
Yeah.
I should take that advice more often.
Yeah.
Let me ask you sort of a last question. What counsel or advice would you give this room, the people who are watching this on TVW, in terms of, these are policy makers, they're policy advocates, they're opinion leaders, and they're working within this context that you describe as fundamentally wrong, but yet those are still the rules by which they're playing today, and probably for the foreseeable future. What counsel and advice do you give them?
So, to be more aggressive. So I've been thinking really hard about political economy and economics and stuff like that for a really long time, and I've been doing research and reading books. And the thing that has surprised me most about learning about economics is discovering that it is just a story. It's a story we tell ourselves to instantiate our social and moral preferences about status, privileges, and power. And it's arbitrary. 3,000 years ago, they had economics. It was called the Code of Hammurabi. And the value of a woman's life was 30 shekels. Kill her, pay somebody 30 shekels. We look at that today and we're like, that's crazy. That's so arbitrary. That's insane. So is $2.13 plus tips. Right? Which is the federal tipped minimum wage. So we value a tipped worker at $2.13 plus tips. What the people who are defending the status quo will tell you is that by definition is just and righteous, that it's a law of nature, that if they were worth more, they would be paid more. That's a lie. That's just a story we have told ourselves that makes a certain class of people insanely rich and most people poor. And you have the power to change that story. There is no earthly reason why every single person working for Walmart shouldn't earn a dignified wage, a wage high enough so that they can raise a family without government assistance. The only reason they don't make that much money is because the good people at Walmart prefer not to pay it. Mm-hmm. That company earns $26 billion pre-tax per year. They could easily afford $10 billion to pay their workers enough to get by without government assistance, and still earn $17 billion pre-tax, right? And you have the power to change that arrangement. That arrangement is arbitrary. It is not written in stone. It is not a law of nature. It is within our power to rearrange the pieces so that we have an economy that benefits everyone, not just people like me. And it's on you to do it.
Let's give him a round of applause. Nick Hanauer. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, man.
Appreciate your time.
Yeah.